Be warned, if you have not already learnt the fate of the Obra Dinn, then this video is not for you. Come back once you think you know all there is to know. We'll go from there. Let's start at the beginning. Where are we? We're in a small boat in Falmouth that's just pulled up beside the Obra Dinn. What's the Obra Dinn? It's a ghost ship. Some bad things happened. Who are we? We're the Chief Inspector of the East India Company, randomly either male or female who always wears gloves, even at home. Who's that guy? He's the only animated character we'll be seeing all game, except for our own slightly uncanny pair of arms. Why are we here? To inspect the damage to the ship and write up an insurance assessment. Fun. Why is the Obra Dinn here? Well, a man called Martin's dying wish to a mermaid was that the ship return to Falmouth, but we'll get back to that much later. The first thing to note on boarding the ship is that one of the masts has snapped. In fact, a horizontal yard is missing. We get to see it in two memories. In the first, it's barely visible, and in the second, it's being wielded by the Kraken. It has since disappeared. Two rowboats are also missing. These were taken by Nichols, then returned by Nichols, then one was used in a failed escape, and the other in a successful escape. Up on the stern deck lie a number of strange pieces of wood. These are all that remain of a chicken coop. There used to be a cage with a pig in it here too, but that was strung over the side and has since disappeared. There was another cage of piglets on the main deck that disappeared during the Kraken attack, and also a cage holding a goat. This goat appears in 9 memories, which is as many as the cook, the helmsman, the captain's steward, and the captain's wife combined. During the execution, the goat says an emotional farewell to its friend. Later, it narrowly avoids being spiked by a mermaid because 2 humans happen to be standing in the way. It sees the arrival of the crab riders. It can be heard warning Lars about getting on the boat, and it watches later as all 3 boat occupants are killed. During the Kraken attack, the goat appears to be chewing on one of the bars of its cage. In the present day, the bar is broken and the goat is gone. On the gun deck, things are a little messy. Walker, the penultimate survivor on board the ship, still has his hammer cup. In the kitchen, the cook's fork can be found in the corner. The kettle can be found on the floor, presumably from when it was knocked around in Chapter 7, implying no one on board had had a cup of tea since before the Kraken attacked. No wonder they were in such bad moods. If you yourself want a cup of tea coincidentally, then you'll need to solve all the fates on board the ship. Then in the epilogue, the housekeeper will tell you that there's more tea in the kitchen. Miss even one solvable fate, however, and the housekeeper will tell you that there's no tea left. On the other side of the gun deck are the officers' rooms. The bosun's room has his signature whistle, the bosun's mate's room has his, cannon, and Bill Hoskett's room has his... Wait, what is that? It's actually a candlestick. The inspector has 2 identical ones on their mantelpiece. If you look closely over Bill's shoulder, you can see it's meant to be standing up. That means Bill Hoskett had the only open flame on the ship. If you look really closely, you can see it's been relit by the pocket watch. John Davies' room is filled with clutter. There are even 2 bookshelves, even though all his books could fit onto one. But maybe he just repurposed Nichols' stuff after his death? After all, his room is next door, and feels quite empty. Except, we can actually just about see both bookshelves in John's room when Nichols is still alive. So, why does he have 2 bookshelves? On a similar note, that chair isn't a normal chair. The only other place they appear on the ship is in the officer's mess. Was John Davies supposed to have this in his room? The weird thing is, when given the chance, he'd rather sit on a wooden chair anyway. So either John Davies is very kind to his young steward, or the man's a kleptomaniac. At the back of the officer's mess is a toilet for 2, although the only time we see someone doing their business is Edward Spratt just as the Kraken attacks, but he chooses to go somewhere else. Was he not a high enough ranking officer to use the toilets? Or perhaps someone was already using it and having a bad time, and Spratt wanted to avoid sitting next to them. Interestingly, there is only one person on board the ship that is definitely alive throughout the Kraken attack, but doesn't appear in any scene in chapters 7 or 8, and that's Bill Hoskett. He's no coward, he gets involved in chapter 5, fights the spider crabs in chapter 6, and gets as close to the action as possible in chapters 9 and 10. He just mysteriously disappears for chapters 7 and 8. So the poor guy must have had even worse bowels than Spratt. Down on the orlop deck, the surgery is in surprisingly good shape, considering the angles the ship achieved during the Kraken attack. In an earlier memory, Wallace can be seen leaning back in his chair. In the present day, the chair is tipped over, and Wallace is dead. The carpenter's door is missing another axe, which is up by the body of Bill Hoskett, and also another hammer, which the carpenter can be seen holding in this scene. The gun and store, on the other hand, is missing rather a lot. Down on the cargo deck, the captain's store contains an astonishing number of bottles, and finally there's the locked lazarette. We'll come back here later. There is one other thing we have in our possession, a box. The box was given to us by Henry Evans, the surgeon of the ship. The inspector claims not to know what's in the box, and Evans writes in the preface that he assumes we were already on board the ship, meaning it's likely the box was sent to us with a note telling us not to open it until we were on board the Obra Dinn. We didn't quite make it, but close enough. Why does Evans send you the box? Well, he could use the monkey's paw to work out that A. Martin asked the Mermaid to bring the Obra Dinn home, and B. the captain's threats to the Mermaid caused the Kraken to go away, so could conclude that the Mermaid was open to suggestion from the humans, and that the Obra Dinn would probably return to Falmouth. Evans started the book intending to finish it himself, presumably by catching the Obra Dinn on its return. However, he claims that he suffers from ill health, which could well be some sort of memory loss considering how little of the book he is able to fill in himself. Whether or not this memory loss is caused by years of using the pocket watch is unclear. Why does he want you to wait until you're on the ship to open the box? Well, for one, he wants to ensure the pocket watch is used for the right purpose, and two, he can't be sure that the ship will return. And if it doesn't, or if he recovers from his ill health in time, he would presumably want to take back the book and watch for himself and do his own private investigations without the investigator finding out his secret. To be fair, it takes a lot of courage to send your pocket watch to an insurance inspector, since every time you see Evans, it's because he failed his job. Often comically. Did Evans manage to help a lot of people as well? Probably. But if they didn't die, then we don't get to see them. The only notable exception is the helmsman, who gets speared in the leg in chapter 3 and yet lives until the end of chapter 7. So, well done, Henry. This book is now our only outside source of information about what happened on the ship. But where are the ship's official documents? The purser took them on a lifeboat and threw them in the sea. Great. Evans included 3 sketches from the artist Edward Spratt. The first is a scene on the main deck towards the bow. But hang on, Samuel Peters is alive. Didn't he die when they were loading cargo in Falmouth? Well, yes, but the ship originally started in London, then made its way to Falmouth, loaded up and went from there. This sketch was made on the journey in between. There's the sketch of the Formosans standing outside the little passenger area on the yacht deck. And there's the sketch of the execution of Hock Seng Lao. There are a few creative liberties in this sketch. It avoids drawing people squatting, plotting or covering their ears. That includes drawing Alexei Toporov as right-handed, and in reality he was left-handed. Unfortunately, Evans doesn't fill in much of the book for you. He does, however, name each of 10 chapters. For example, he names the 4th chapter The Calling, which doesn't seem to fit the events very well, but then again it's unlikely Evans knew exactly what happened in it. The 8th chapter is called The Bargain because Evans has already seen those events by using the pocket watch on the monkey's paw. He doesn't give you the paw yet, though. He claims he wishes to keep the chapter's contents private. Maybe because it involves him killing his pet monkey, or because it paints his captain in a negative light. He may also wish to protect the identities of those who went against the captain's orders and rescued the mermaid, but we'll come back to that later. The 9th chapter is called Escape, because that's the main thing that happens as far as Evans is concerned. And the final chapter is called The End, because Evans didn't know exactly what happened, so we just gave it a generic name. Evans himself escaped with 3 others at the end of chapter 9, a bit of a bold move when the Kraken kind of got too far, but all 4 of them made it to Morocco, and according to the letter we get at the end of the game, they seem to stay there together. There is one more important clue in the book, however. Evans prints where each body can be found on the ship. The first body is inside a barrel on the cargo deck, a stowaway. But why does a stowaway die again? Well, the simple answer is so that we can travel back to chapter 1. Samuel Peters' body, of course, is no longer on the ship. There's always a death at the end of each chapter, or sometimes chapters, that lets us travel back to see the events. But this note in the book means Evans knew about the stowaway, so perhaps he kept the body hidden on purpose with the intention of using the pocket watch on it later. Then there's the cow's skull. Again, perhaps Evans encouraged the butcher to keep it after witnessing the deaths of the Indian seamen. Then there's a bit of a weird one, a foot hanging outside a window. You can see how Tim got his foot caught in the rope as he was shot. But that can't be right. You're telling me Tim died in chapter 3 and no one took the body down for the rest of the story? It's a bit of a contrivance, but after Tim's death on the starboard side, every important thing has to happen off the port side so that no one notices the body. This includes the return of Nichols' crew, the launching of both the rowboats, and the attack of the Kraken. But why didn't Bill Hoskett notice it outside his window? Well, in 9.1, you can actually see through Bill's window, and the rope is hanging lower than it is in present day. But Hoskett seems to have noticed the body anyway, as in the next scene Walker is about to cut the rope. Fortunately for us, he is then distracted by a commotion on the stern deck. Perhaps Walker dragged the rope up a bit first, or perhaps over time the wind has dragged the foot upwards. The fourth body is actually in Chapter 5, John Naples' leg. This one lets us go back through the entirety of Chapter 5 and Chapter 4. Did Evans have something to do with this one? Maybe. Confusingly, Naples died at the front of the ship. Dahl caught him as he came down the stairs carrying the Mermaid and sliced his leg off. But his leg is at the back of the boat, so how did it get there? Well, perhaps Evans saw his chance to hide it before attending to John. However, there is also a popular theory online that his monkey stole the leg, which is quite fun. Either way, Evans evidently knows about it. Get used to this death scene, by the way. We'll be talking about it on many more occasions. We then have Zungi's body hidden in the port walk for Chapter 6. Zungi would have had to crawl past Evans on his way there. In fact, it's even possible that Evans told him to hide back there on purpose so he'd have a body to use to inspect the crab riders later. We then have the spider crab corpse hidden in the cargo hold. For Chapter 7, there's the remains of Edward's frat. No one wants to get their hands dirty moving that mess. We have Roderick's corpse, which presumably was trapped under a cannon and a tired crew gave up trying to lift it. And Abigail's corpse, in her bed. For Chapter 9, we have Midshipman's Tom's corpse. Perhaps the mutiny squad were fond of Tom and didn't want to throw him overboard, or perhaps they got distracted by the whole mutiny thing. But why did Evans know it was there? He wrote the location in the book, remember? Well, perhaps as he was escaping, he saw the crew dumping the bodies from the ship and they shouted to tell him that Tom was dead in his room? Who knows? But perhaps most interesting in the book is the fact that Evans has marked in where the final 4 bodies from Chapter 10 are, despite not being on the ship at the time. To be fair, he had only just left the ship at the end of Chapter 9, so perhaps from afar he could see the 3 mutiny squad men try to enter the captain's quarters, then he hears a couple of gunshots and nobody leaves. That's why he says that 1 body is outside and there must be 3 inside. That's all the information that Evans gives us in his book. However, we've played this game before, and we know how everyone dies. Just in case you don't remember though, here's a very quick recap. The gunner dies to his own cannon, the gunner's mate dies to his own gun, the carpenters are nailed to the wall and floor, the helmsman was taken for a spin, the surgeon's mate gets his head amputated, the cook is slapped by a fish, the butcher is butchered, Duncan was dunked in, Edward's brat died of siege, relieved himself, the boatswain loses his right-hand man to the Kraken and then becomes a right-hand man. The time-travelling doctor gets into a small wooden box with his companions and then disappears. As for the heroic midshipman, Charlie dies in his own fire, Pete dies to his own explosives, and Tom brings neither a gun nor a knife to a gun and knife fight. The 4 Masons are all killed trying to protect a shell that causes a lot of trouble and gets given back to the Mermaid in the end anyway. As for the mates, well, first the second mate gets shot, second the third mate gets spiked, and third the fourth mate gets clubbed, and fourth, the first mate gets shot, same as the second mate. The stewards are divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The top men are shot, speared, zapped, snip, snapped, slit, slapped, kebabbed, and brutally smacked. The seamen die from mermaid, headshot, poor sailing, no leg, disease, cannon, fell down the stairs, insufficient human body shield, sliced throats, revenge, poor life choices, and an accident, the ropes. Finally, the captain's wife dies trying to reunite with the captain, and the captain dies trying to reunite with his wife. Oh, and that one guy that plays the fiddle, he gets murdered. There's a whole chapter named after his death. Fun fact, the last name on the manifest is the first to die, and the first name on the manifest is the last to die, at least on board the ship. Most of the possible fates can be used at some point, but not all of them. No one is axed, unfortunately. Gibbs threw an axe at a crab rider, but it bounced off. Bill Hoskett tries to get to the captain with an axe later, but falls short. But there is actually one axe death on the ship, or at least partially caused by an axe, and that's the cow. But the game doesn't let us fill that one in ourselves. No one is crushed by stones, not really sure why that one's in there. And no one expires, that's the one you always go for and then realise it means died from old age. No top men fall from the rigging, although Omid Gul does kind of fall, it's just not entirely clear how he ended up in this situation. No one freezes to death, that would have been certainly hard to tell in a freeze frame. No one is shot by an arrow, there are no hooves or wings, and the only suicide is with a gun, probably because suicide with a spear sounds like more effort than it's worth. No one is cannibalised, but you can say some sailors were eaten by the Kraken. There is also technically a couple of times that you can use poisons, which is when someone plunges their hand into the chest liquid, which is some very interesting looking poison. You can also put down burnt or electrocuted. There are a lot of other deaths that can have multiple answers too. For example, George Shirley is last seen trying to rescue the gunner from a tentacle. But what happens next? Does he fall out the window? Was that scream we heard him? Or does the cannonball kill him? Does he die in the cannon's explosion? Does the Kraken grab him? If so, is he crushed, torn apart, drowned or eaten? The inspector has no idea, so you can write whatever you like in the book as long as it sounds plausible. There is also this awkward development time-lapse where George is maybe moved out through the window. I can't really tell. In contrast, some deaths only accept one answer, like Hokseng Lao was shot by Brennan and not the gunner or the captain, or Zungi was shot by Charles Minor. The two perpetrators are then fined at the end, as in the eyes of the inspector, they are the murderers. However, technically you can write whatever you like for all the deaths, as long as you're not concerned about getting the true ending. The inspector will then include all your wacky claims in the insurance report. You can famously pin all the deaths on the captain for a secret achievement. The report doesn't mention how the inspector came to all their conclusions, allowing them to presumably keep the pocket watch a secret. Interestingly, even if you do go for the true ending, you do still get some choice. Like, you can put the gunner down as being shot by Abraham Akbar, because he technically lit the fuse that killed him. You can also blame Charlie's death on Pete's stray sword. If you do this, the book will accept both answers, and Pete and Abraham's estates will be fined rather than rewarded in the end. Basically, you can't trust the book. It's written by Evans and the inspector to the best of their ability, but it's not perfect. The inspector actually ends up erasing some of Evans' titles when new information is found. They even erase the title for the monkey's death and then write the exact same thing back in, but this time they write it all on the same line. So, was Evans leaving space to put a portrait of the monkey on this page? I mean, it was probably just a mistake, but I love the idea that Evans wanted to sketch his pet. We have been assuming one thing though, that everything in the book was either written in at the beginning by Evans or is information that the inspector has discovered so far. But is this true? There are a few weird things, like the route maps. Could the inspector have worked this out from looking at the memory? It's probably an educated guess. Or how does the inspector know which people are in the hammock scene? Again, who really cares? It's plausible. There is also a strangely detailed description of the monkey, but the inspector probably just got a bit creative towards the end. There is, however, only one instance I found where information is put into the book that the inspector couldn't possibly have known about, and it's this picture at the start of chapter 5. What's wrong with this picture? Well, nothing's wrong with this picture. In fact, it matches up almost exactly with the scene in chapter 5 part 2. It's got the ropes, the net, the surgeon's kit, the bloodstain. The thing is, this picture is drawn in before we see this scene. Every other chapter in the book gets a picture of something we've seen before, because of course it does. This is the only one that shows us something we haven't seen yet. The escape chapter does have a picture of a boat before we've seen the survivors in the boat, but it's just a generic boat. In fact, it's the same as the one we arrived in. In contrast, this scene is very specific. The main deck isn't even loaded in when we draw it. So a really observant player could work out that there's a death on the main deck in chapter 5, probably caused by the unholy captives that were in that net, before they've even found the dead body. That's insane. There's still one more important item in the box. The compass. No, wait, the pocket watch. It will turn out to be not as simple as we might have hoped. But let's start with the basics. When we find the remains of a body, we can use the watch to view the moment they died. What counts as death? It's not as precise as you might think. When Brennan is knifed by the captain, the watch counts the moment of death as the moment the knife slits his throat. But in the next scene, Brennan can still be heard choking and is seen clutching at his throat. On the other hand, the cow is struck by an axe to the side of the head, then has its throat slit, but still the death doesn't count until 14 seconds later. That's a long time. Gunshot deaths are counted as soon as the person is hit, as are some spike deaths, but other spike deaths take a very long time. So the moment of death isn't measured particularly precisely. So what counts as alive? We've seen it works on mermaids, spider crabs, cows, and the smallest animal we use it on is the monkey. Would it work on a mouse or a flea? Presumably there's a limit. For that matter, what about stages of pregnancy? When does the watch think that life begins? You can say. None of the characters were pregnant as far as we know. How much of a dead body do we need? We see it works with just a skull or a skeletal foot, but it probably wouldn't work with much less than that. For example, if it worked on just an ear, then Evans might have thought to obtain an ear collection before he leaves, which would have made it a lot easier to complete the book. What do we mean by viewing a memory? Given that we only have a limited view distance in the memory, it seems we're just being shown the death scene, rather than travelling back there ourselves. We can't change anything, obviously. When we exit a memory, we are still stood in the same place. What does it look like for other people? Again, tricky to say. So what are the limits of the watch? I think the furthest we stretch its powers are with the monkey's paw in the epilogue. By this point, the monkey died several years ago. We are also presumably on our home in England, meaning the monkey died hundreds of miles away. And we're only using a paw, which is not a large body part, so this watch is pretty powerful. We might get some decay in the quality of the memory after more years pass, but imagine if these memories could go back a long time. At the extreme, you could imagine going to Pompeii and viewing the moments that these people were covered in volcanic ash, or using it on a corpse preserved in a peat bog to travel back thousands of years. Even just on a day-to-day basis, there's lots of stuff to do. Evans presumably used it to make post-mortems a lot easier, and the inspector probably continues to use it to make their future inspections easier. But if you're willing to sacrifice a few animals, you could use it more deviously. You could cheat at card games by killing an animal, using the watch on it in private, then walking around and viewing your opponent's cards. Or cheat at anything really. Or use it for spying. You just need to get comfortable making animal sacrifices. But we still haven't looked at the most surprising aspect of the watch, something that only becomes apparent in one specific memory. Let's return to the death of John Naples. You'll remember that he died towards the front of the ship, but his leg is found at the back of the ship. In fact, his leg isn't in his death scene at all. What? We can cut a body part off someone, and even if they die later, we can still use this body part to view their death. So if we cut off his hands, preserved it, gave him a hook for a hand or something, then waited till he's miles away, could we tell when he died by using the watch on his hands? If so, we could set up a similar thing but with animals, and then use the watch to communicate across the world. Just write down a message before the animal dies, and someone on the other side of the world with the watch and an animal's body parts can see what you've written. Neat. Except, I don't think that's how it works. I always thought that the watch was able to follow a being back in time to the moment of their death, but with John Naples, this just doesn't seem to make sense. Does the watch follow the leg back in time until it was joined to John, and then follows the rest of John forward in time? Let me explain a different theory. There's a couple of important pieces of information that I've been avoiding. Our first clue is that each time you find a body inside a memory, a white trail appears from the watch in the real world, forming into a ghostly corpse. This suggests to me that the death memory was being stored inside the watch. The second piece of evidence is that the box we received from Evans was on the Obra Dinn for its journey. It can be seen under the bed in the surgeon's office, and on the boat when Evans is escaping. We can't be sure that it contains the watch, but I'm going to say that the watch is probably somewhere on the ship. We also know that Evans was at least aware of the functionality of the watch. That's why he kills his monkey in chapter 8, so he can return to that memory later and memory hop through the events of the lazarettes. It's worth noting that he ties a rope to his monkey so that he can pull it back and cut the paw off afterwards. But we now know he could have cut the paw off before it died. But obviously that wouldn't be very pleasant for Evans or the monkey. So Evans had the watch on board the Obra Dinn. Why is this important? Well, it at least makes it plausible that perhaps the watch needs to have been nearby when a person dies in order for it to store the death memory. The furthest away people get is in chapter 4, when Nichols and his crew died to the mermaids, but this still might not have been that far from the Obra Dinn itself. Also, Evans does leave at the end of chapter 9 and takes the box with him, but as I've mentioned before, the notes in the book suggest that Evans couldn't have got that far from the Obra Dinn by the time chapter 10 happens. But we've still got one more crucial clue, though it's quite subtle. We need to look at what time the watch displays when you find a body. The hour hand points to the chapter number, and the minute hand points to the part number. So this one is chapter 5, part 1. This is quite a specific detail, especially since you can just open the book while looking at a body to flip to which death it was. So why does the watch show this? I think it indicates that the memories of the Obra Dinn have already been stored and sorted inside the watch by Henry Evans. That's why the watch display matches up with the chapter order in the book. In other words, that anti-clockwise spinning you see on the watch each time you unlock a new memory, that's not the watch rewinding time. It's more like a safe than a watch, it's unlocking the memory. In fact, in the original trailer for the game, the watch hands spin clockwise, because of course it's not rewinding time. And when you come back to a body that you've already visited, the clock hands don't spin at all. They're already in the right position because you've already unlocked that memory. So my theory is that the watch needs to be close by when someone dies in order for the death memory to be stored in the watch. Evans can then organise the death stored inside. However, in order to view one of these memories, we need to trigger it by reminding the watch of who we're remembering. This makes John Naples' leg make more sense. The watch is using this leg to unlock the memory of John Naples that it already has stored inside it. We only ever see the minute hand pointing to whole numbers, which could suggest that there aren't many other deaths stored in the watch, but that's a bit of speculation. Whether or not these deaths' memories can be overwritten by new ones is also unclear. But hang on a second, if Evans had the pocket watch on board the Obra Dinn, then why didn't he use it? He could have solved Nunzio Pasquale's murder and prevented a lot of trouble. Well, first of all, we don't know that he didn't use it. He could have done, but evidently he wanted to keep the watch a secret, what with a ship full of superstitious crew members. In fact, we know he knew where all the bodies were because he wrote down the locations in the book, so maybe he did do his own investigating. And regarding the murder, it would be very dangerous to put the blame on the second mate if you weren't going to explain your magic pocket watch. There is one more strange aspect of this watch that we need to talk about before we can move on. The watch can open doors. If you visit a memory with an open door in it, then sometimes the watch will open that door in the real world. This even gets through doors that were previously locked. More than that, it seems to have a kind of sentience, opening doors that will help us find more bodies and relighting old lanterns, rather than throwing kettles around or standing chairs back up again. I think this is the best evidence we have that it's not just memories that are being stored in the watch, but possibly actual ghosts or fragments of souls that are being released and changed in the world to help us. The whole opening doors thing could be a useful function of the watch, but it seems it's more based on the whims of the ghosts inside than on any predictable logic. Presumably though, this effect is only local, right? So heavy evidence using the watch in Morocco didn't open the door of the lazarette on the ship hundreds of miles away. Although, there is one thing. The captain's door is locked when we first find the ship, but it's unlocked in the final memory. How did the door lock? Does this mean the pocket watch was able to lock the door when Evans used it on the monkey's paw? Seems a bit of a stretch if you ask me. I think it makes more sense that the door just has an old-fashioned lock on it, and the force of the wind was enough to make it lock. So there are ghosts in the pocket watch? Maybe that seems obvious to you. Another thing you may have assumed is that the ghosts of the pocket watch help you write the book. And there's some evidence towards this. The skull found in the back of the book matches the skull in the pocket watch, suggesting they could be related, and of course the chapter order of the book matches the times on the pocket watch. I've been assuming that the inspector filled in the book themselves, but maybe it is the ghosts. It would explain how the picture in chapter 5 was drawn before we see it. However, the thing about the book is, of course, it's hard to tell what's added just as a game mechanic and what's meant as a story element, so this is as far as I can really speculate. Now we've figured out one of the magic items in the game, it's time to take a look at perhaps the most confusing and widely debated aspect of the entire game, the shells. If you thought it was complicated this far, then strap yourself in. Before we start theorising, let's just lay out everything that we know for sure. We'll come back and fill in the details later. So, the Formosans have brought with them a chest, which they keep guarded in the passenger storage. The chest has two compartments. The lower one contains a shell, and the upper one contains a dangerous liquid. The shell does not actually emit light, and its glow is the only animated thing inside the memories, meaning it's probably more of a supernatural aura. We can even see the distant glow when we first board the ship, before we've ever held the pocket watch, so it's not just an illusion from the watch. Thus, I'd assume that the other characters can also see the glow. The glow can sometimes be seen through objects that are close to the shell, but to me this seems to be more of a quirk of the graphics system. Somewhat interestingly though, the glow does not appear on Dahl's death portrait in the book, which could suggest that it's more of a feeling rather than something you can see, but I'm not sure. As for the liquid in the upper compartment, deaths caused by it can either be put down as burnt, poisoned or electrocuted, so it's very possible it's actually some kind of magic incredibly deadly substance. It melts both Xia's and Dahl's arms to the bone. It also appears to erupt into flames when it comes into contact with flesh. When Nichols discovers the shell, he takes the chest for himself and kidnaps two of the Formosans. Their rowboats are attacked by 3 mermaids. Their left hands are clawed, while their right hands are normal. 2 of the 3 mermaids have shells of their own, which appear to be identical to the one in the chest. The third mermaid does not have a shell. Itzbeng Xia takes the shell from the lower compartment and plunges it into the liquid in the upper compartment. Something interesting happens and the mermaids become weaker. The Formosan shell remains inside the liquid in the upper compartment. Also, the other mermaid shells glow dimmer now that the Formosan shell is in the liquid, and now they only glow at all when you're looking directly at them. The mermaids continue to be weak and their shells continue to glow dimly as the rowboats pull up beside the Obra Dinn. The 3 mermaids are loaded up into a net and taken down into the lazarette. The Formosan's chest, still containing a shell in the top compartment, is also placed there. Later, Philip Dahl is intrigued by the chest and plunges his hand into the mystery liquid. He manages to retrieve the Formosan's shell, but dies in the process. The shell glows brightly, much brighter than it was glowing before. The captain comes in later and kills 2 of the mermaids, however he does not touch the shell on Dahl's corpse. Later still, Martin, Paul and Davy come to rescue the last mermaid. They hand it the Formosan shell from Dahl's corpse and throw the mermaid overboard. Martin asks the mermaid to guide the Obra Dinn home. In the present day, the Obra Dinn has returned to Falmouth, and a shell can be seen glowing brightly in the distance. That's the basic story. It's worth noting that apparently in the initial release of the game, there were even fewer clues to the positions of the shells, but I'm going off the current patch. and if you squint at our story, it almost looks like we have all the details. Alas, we have a long way to go. Okay, first let's figure some things out about the mermaids. It's very likely the mermaids can understand spoken language, as they fulfill Martin's quite specific dying wish. But do they understand language, or can they just read minds? Well, earlier in the same scene, the mermaid is thrashing about as the crew try to rescue her, but she stops thrashing as soon as Martin finishes saying, "We're here to rescue you," and quite a bit before being given a shell, which to me is good proof that the mermaids aren't psychic, they are actually listening to what people are saying. At least one of the mermaids can also call upon the Kraken. How do we know this? Because the captain's threats to the mermaids seem to work. And it almost certainly is the mermaids that stop the Kraken, because the captain doesn't kill the last one, and according to John Davies, the captain comes up from the lazarette as the Kraken goes away. By the time Martin arrives, the storm sounds like it's calmed down and the ship doesn't appear to be rolling as much. Also, the crab riders seem to head straight for the lazarette rather than killing everyone else on board, so we can assume they're with the mermaids too. It's also implied that the mermaids and possibly the crab riders have some control over the weather, as this lightning strike is very appropriately timed to the crab riders' arrival. We also have the storm during the Kraken attack that stops once the Kraken disappears, and also the storm that eventually sinks the Obra Dinn that you can see start as you're leaving. This could mean the mermaid guided the Obra Dinn home using the wind and waves, and managed to protect it from storms. It's not entirely clear. So, the mermaids can understand human speech, influence the weather, and communicate with other ocean beasts. They're definitely powerful, but nothing too groundbreaking here. Now let's look at the shells. The mermaids seem to be able to sense the shells. This explains why they happen to be in the middle of the ocean off the coast of Africa. They've been following the Obra Dinn to get the shell for a long time. There's also this scene where the mermaid without the shell appears to be reaching towards the chest where the shell is stored, or perhaps they're just reaching out to try and grab another sailor to drown. I can't be sure. There's a common theory online that the lower compartment of the chest prevents the mermaids from being able to sense the shells. The main evidence is that the mermaids only come to attack after Nichols opens the chest. I'm not convinced by this, however. For one, the shell is put back inside the chest as it's being transported onto the rowboats and away from the Obra Dinn, but the mermaids still go after it. How did they know it was there? Although it is possible they're familiar with the chest from before. Another bit of evidence, though, is that the last mermaid manages to take the ship back to Falmouth. How did she know that the ship came from Falmouth? Well, it's possible that the mermaids have been following the Formosans for a long time, at least since Falmouth, patiently waiting for their opportunity to strike. Thus, they must have been able to sense the shell when it was inside the chest. But if the mermaids know the shell is on the Obra Dinn, then why didn't they attack earlier? Well, for one, 3 mermaids against a giant ship can't do very much. We see the mermaids wait until they're in the rowboats to attack. But then, why don't the mermaids use the crab riders or the Kraken to get the shell back? Well, remember, we only have evidence that the shells are linked to the mermaids. It seems unlikely that the Kraken would care about the shells at all, or that a mermaid losing a shell would warrant calling the Kraken. And the crab riders don't have shells of their own, so they probably don't have anything to do with them. I think it's much more likely that the crab riders and Kraken were only called to rescue the mermaids. The other reason that the mermaids didn't attack, of course, is that the Formosan chest is designed to ward off mermaids. If they got too close, the Formosans could plunge the shell in and the mermaids would be rendered as good as dead. But if the mermaids knew the danger, then why did they attack? Well, remember that they can understand spoken language. So it's possible that as they surveyed the crew of the rowboats, they realised that the only 2 people that knew what the chest was for were tied up, and that only one other person on the boats understood their language. This could well be why the mermaids targeted the translator Hwang first, or this could be a coincidence. Either way, the mermaids seized their chance. Unfortunately for them, Bang Siar was able to cut himself free on one of the mermaid's spears, and plunge the shell in anyway. The mermaid's health is also somehow linked to the shells, since when the Formosan shell is plunged into the liquid, all the mermaids grow weak, including the one without a shell to begin with. But what exactly is going on here? I always assumed that when a shell is damaged, all the mermaids and shells also grow weaker. But this doesn't take into account one thing. When the shell is removed from the liquid later, it glows brighter than before. And I think it's still glowing brightly in the present day. How can damaging a shell make it glow brighter? Well, another possibility is that these beams aren't being sent out from the damaged shell, they're going into the shell. The chest shell is absorbing the energy from the other mermaids and shells, causing the other shells to glow dimmer and the mermaids to get weak, but causing the Formosan shell to get brighter. Unfortunately, we never get to see the other 2 shells after the Formosan shell is removed from the liquid, so we can't know whether they would keep glowing dimly or go back to normal or even glow brightly like the Formosan shell did. This is just one thing I'm still not quite sure about. So what happens when Dahl removes the shell? It seems likely that this causes the mermaids to get their energy back, and it's why they're able to call on the crab riders and later the Kraken. I can't be sure of this though. The best evidence is when the captain is interrogating Cho-Tan. The Formosan says, "The shell must be protected, we will all die," which could be a warning that if some idiot were to take the shell out of the liquid, then they would all die. But he could be saying two different things here, that the shell has to remain in the liquid to keep the mermaids weak, and that they're all going to die anyway because of other mythical beasts. All I have to go on is the rough English translation, so I can't be sure either way. When does Dahl remove the shell? His death is at the start of chapter 8, but remember we can't trust the book to be perfectly accurate. The general consensus is that Dahl removes the shell from the liquid between chapters 5 and 6, allowing the mermaids to call the crab riders for chapter 6. But why does Dahl plunge his hand into the liquid? Well, first of all, he thinks that the liquid is quicksilver, or mercury, which wouldn't be nearly as bad to stick your hand into briefly. But how does he know the shell's in there? Well, it's worth noting that we can't see beneath the surface of water due to the game's graphics, but it's likely that other characters can. Did Dahl have a plan for using the shell? It's hard to say. Okay, before we go any further, there's a very common theory online that the shells cause people to go mad over them. But I don't think so. Nichols is happy to leave the shell in the chest. It seems no one even notices the mermaid shell until Cho-Tan points it out, and even then most crew members ignore them until the final chapters. The captain completely ignores Dahl's shell, and most of all when the rescue gang turn up, they're more than happy to give the final shell away. Another variant of the theory is that the mermaids cause people to go mad, like sirens would. But there's no evidence of them acting like sirens, literally nobody is entranced by their looks. The only strange deaths are Thomas Sefton, who we'll talk about later, and isn't that surprising, and the death of John Naples. So, why did Philip Dahl kill John Naples again? Well, Dahl tells us his motivation in Naples' death scene. He says he thinks the mermaids should be thrown back into the ocean instead of being kept on the ship. And of course he's completely right. So what was his plan? I think it's most likely that he was trying to stop the seamen from taking the mermaids to the lazarette, maybe even try to convince them to carry the mermaids back up again, or rather threatened them to do so with a sword. But the seamen refused and tried to disarm Dahl, leading to Naples losing his leg. They eventually did subdue him, and the mermaids were transported the rest of the way. Dahl acted so aggressively because he feared the crab riders and Kraken that show up later. In other words, I don't think there's enough reason to believe that this is the mermaids mind controlling him or something, especially given that we don't see this effect at all anywhere else. There is also, however, a variant of the theory that states that the mermaids bring a curse onto the ship. Philip Dahl is the first to make claims about a curse, and Alfred Klessel overhears and repeats the claims later in his death scene. If by curse they mean the Kraken, then technically yes, but the mermaids also seem to be able to call off the Kraken, so is it still a curse if you can turn it on and off? Some people, though, use the idea of a curse to explain why everyone ends up killing each other. And to be honest, it's possible, but there's really no evidence for this, especially since by the final couple of chapters, all the mermaids are either dead or escaped anyway, and I think all the shells have already been thrown overboard. So in my opinion, the chaos in the last couple of chapters is due to the humans, not due to some supernatural force. You can't exactly prove there isn't a curse, but I think it makes for a better story without one. That's just my opinion though. So, the only real magic of the shells that we know of is the fact that it's somehow magically linked to the mermaids, and they give off a weird supernatural glow. Some people claim they give the mermaids their powers, which could well be true, but it's not clear if the mermaids would have these powers anyway, and just need to be conscious in order to use them. But still, these shells are quite far from the all-powerful artifacts that you might have thought they were. So now let's ask, what do the Formosans know about them? Well, first, the Formosans are familiar with the mermaids, because Shah talks to Lim about the monsters coming before the mermaids arrive. They've evidently encountered mermaids before. Perhaps mermaid attacks are more common occurrence around Formosa? This also explains why Shah doesn't just give the shell to the mermaids. He's familiar enough with them to know that even if he did, the mermaids would kill them all anyway. It's also possible that the Formosan shell originally belonged to the mermaid that was missing a shell, and perhaps the Formosans have managed to pry it off her at an earlier date. This reframes the story as the mermaids trying to reclaim their stolen property. However, there's not a whole lot of evidence for this, so we can't know for sure. The Formosans are also familiar with how to use the shell with the chest. The chest itself appears to be from Formosa, although I can't be certain of this. It also appears to be designed with the purpose of being a weapon against the mermaids, suggesting the Formosans have experimented with damaging the shell to their advantage before. But why would the Formosans take a chest containing a mermaid shell in it over an ocean, and then all the way back again? Doesn't that seem dangerous? Let's look at the Formosans' dialogue. Miss Lim says, "The chest, it must not fall into the ocean." We already know that it's not because doing so will attract the mermaids. The Formosans are expecting the mermaids to turn up anyway, and indeed the mermaids do turn up. Is it because they think the shell is very valuable? If so, it seems a bit odd to take it on a long journey around the world when the mermaids could try and get it back at any moment. Plus, you'd have thought that the lives of the royalty would mean more than the safety of a shell. The answer, I think, is more simple than that. They take the shell with them to scare off the mermaids. The mermaids know that if they get close, the Formosans will plunge the shell into the liquid and they'll be incapacitated. So the reason the Formosans have this chest is for their own protection. The reason this feels counterintuitive is because the chest ends up being the reason why the mermaids do attack. But remember, that's only because Nichols tied up the only people who knew how to use the chest and practically handed the shell to the mermaids. Miss Lim doesn't want the chest to fall into the ocean because it's their only bargaining chip to keep the mermaids away. Okay, we're definitely getting somewhere here. We can get back to the actual story very soon. But to recap, here's the main theory so far. The Formosans have taken a chest with them in order to use it as a weapon against any mermaids, ensuring their journey is safe. 3 mermaids have followed the movements of the boat for some time, with the aim of retrieving their stolen shell. They then seize the opportunity when the chest is put into the rowboats and the Formosans are tied up, but Xiar manages to break free and plunge the shell into the chest anyway. The mermaids remain stunned while the shell is in the liquid, and Tan attempts to warn them of this, but is cut short. Dull then inadvertently wakes the mermaids by removing the shell from the liquid. The mermaids summon their friends to try and rescue them, but the captain kills and threatens the mermaids into withdrawing the Kraken. Let's leave it there for a moment. We'll get back to the shells in a minute, but let's first take a brief break to talk about something that's worth mentioning, but doesn't really fit anywhere else in this video. The execution of Hwang Lao. So, there's a popular theory online that Hwang purposely mistranslated Hwang Lao in order to frame him for Nunzio Pasquale's murder. This explains why the captain claims the execution is based on a self-confession. We know Hwang can translate, as he's seen doing so later in the rowboats, although it's worth noting that none of the Chinese top men appear to be able to translate perfectly. He's also working with Nichols, which would explain why he covered up Nichols' murder. It's quite a nice theory, and people are often excited when they realise the connection between the two. However, there are some problems. For one, Hwang Li is also in this scene. We see him translating in chapter 5. If the Formosans had really wanted to, they could have let the captain know through him. It's possible he was also intimidated into protecting Nichols, but you'd have thought at least one member of the crew was loyal to the captain. And the Formosans should know that it was Nichols, right? Surely they should be arguing and pointing fingers. Do you really think that a translator could confidently say, "Oh yeah, he said he did it himself," when the Formosans were angry and defensive? But the only one that seems to protest the execution is Miss Lim. The other two, if anything, seem to be trying to restrain her. And do you think they could have tied him up like that if he had been trying to resist? Do you think the captain would have believed that this guy had self-confessed? And just in general, lying to the captain is a big deal, especially when there are multiple people on board who know that you're lying. Also, I don't get the impression that Nichols had a plan beforehand. I think he just wanted to see what was in the chest, ended up knocking Hwang Lao out, and then only murdered Nunzio Pasqua because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So why would he already be conspiring with Hwang? Or did he quickly rush off, wake up a random Chinese top men and try and convince them to lie to the captain for him? I think it's more likely that the rowboat crew were only recruited closer to the time, but Nichols realised he could do with a translator. Trying to form a crew beforehand would be very risky, as any one of them could have told the captain. So, in my opinion, it's more likely that the Formosans themselves decided to take the blame for the murder, rather than risk escalating a conflict between themselves and the ship officers. The alternative would have been to pick a fight with Nichols based on the word of a guard, and I'd imagine Ikbeng Xiar figured that wouldn't end well. And given that Xiar seems to want to stop Miss Lim from protesting the execution, I think it's likely that Xiar told Hwang Lao to take the blame. Better to lose one guard than have the entire ship turn on you. At this point, remember, to the Formosans it looks like Nichols just wanted to see what was inside the chest. He didn't steal the shell. You have no reason to suspect that he would come back again. So, I just don't buy the Hwang theory. It's a nice idea, but I think the more obvious explanation is the more likely. I don't think Nichols was a mastermind, I think he just got lucky. Well, lucky for a while anyway. Nichols, of course, is eventually shot by Tan. He appears in 9 memories total, making him exactly as important as the goat. And with that out of the way, we're now free to return our attention to the shells, as if we haven't talked about them enough already. The big question we still need to ask is, what happens to the other 2 shells? We see them in the rowboats at the end of chapter 4. Well, somehow, this is the last scene that we ever see these shells in, despite the fact that they are literally the cause of the mutiny in chapter 10. Keeping track of these things is going to be quite a challenge. The rest of this video is going to stray more into speculation than before. There really isn't enough evidence to say things for certain. Okay, let me first explain one popular theory. It goes like this. The mermaids keep their shells as they are transported down to the lazarette. Thomas Sefton is attracted to the shell and ends up dying. The captain, after killing 2 of the mermaids, then takes their shells but ignores the other glowing shell held by Philip Dahl. He then goes up to the top of the ship, then either throws the shells overboard in private so that nobody sees, or keeps the shells to himself. Regardless, the other crew members believe that he has the shells, and so they try and take them back, leading to the mutiny in chapter 10. Right, there are a number of problems with this theory. If he knew about the shells beforehand, why didn't he take them away from the mermaids in chapter 5? Didn't Chotan tell him the shells were dangerous? Why would he let the mermaids keep them? Why can't we see the shells at any point in chapter 5? For that matter, why can't we see the shells at any point in chapter 8? Why does the captain awkwardly lift the heavy grates or stick his hand through the gaps to get the shells, but misses the bright glowing one being held by Dahl? Why did the captain assume the Kraken was caused by the mermaids and that it wasn't being caused by the shells? Wouldn't it make more sense to throw the shells overboard first? If the captain did toss the shells, then why did no one but Paul Moss see him do it, even though John says he saw the captain come up from the hold and many people were on the main deck at the end of chapter 7? If he threw them overboard privately, then why? Why not throw them from the main deck? And then why wouldn't he tell anyone else about it until they were already halfway through the mutiny in chapter 10? Couldn't he easily have prevented it? And why would the captain even bother tossing the shells? Why would he think they were still dangerous when the Kraken had already gone? When he tells Brennan in chapter 10, Brennan seems surprised, like he didn't expect the captain to say that he had tossed them over. And then, where are the shells now? Does the captain toss them after killing Brennan and Walker? Then what was the point of the whole mutiny? And finally, although this might seem like an odd question at the moment, why does Abigail die? She seems safe enough with Paul Moss in the captain's quarters, and she can presumably see that the captain is not on the main deck, which is where the Kraken is attacking, so the likelihood is the captain is safe too. Most people put it down to going mad under high stress, but why doesn't Moss stop her? Is there another reason why she wants to see the captain? I'm going to try to answer all these questions. The basic theory is going to be the shells are instead stored in the captain's quarters. Okay, now let's go back to the very start of chapter 5. The mermaids are just being hauled onto the ship. So, where are the shells? We're looking for 2 mermaid shells, remember? And I'm pretty sure you can't see them in the net. You can count 3 mermaids, one along the bottom, one with their arms sticking out and one with their head just showing. She's the one shooting the spikes. But I can't see any shells. They could be hidden in between the mermaids, and if the mermaids wanted to protect their shells, they would probably try to hide them. In this scene, the captain says he doesn't know what the shells are, so presumably they haven't been taken quite yet. Although it's also possible that they have been taken, and the captain just hasn't noticed them yet. But the captain hears this summary of Chotan's warning. "You talk about shell, very dangerous." Confusingly, by the way, Chotan seems to be referring to the Formosan shell, whereas the only shells that most of the crew ever find out about are the 2 mermaid shells, just keep that in mind. A second later, 2 people die from the mermaids. So what does the captain do? He finds the shells in the mermaid's hair and he takes them for himself. This is my theory. I don't think there's enough reason for him to believe they're supernatural or anything, and if they are dangerous, then taking them away from the mermaid seems like it solves the issue. Or maybe he just thinks they look neat. He then takes the shells and stores them in the captain's quarters, maybe as a trophy or as a gift to his wife. But if you're familiar with the game, then you'll know there's one big catch with this theory, and that's Thomas Sefton. So, Sefton spots them carrying the mermaids, sees the shell, and gets himself killed, right? First, I think Sefton didn't know about the 2 deaths on the main deck, as he was probably in the kitchen, and if he had known, he probably wouldn't have poked the mermaids. But also, I think he probably didn't realise these were even mermaids. After all, they've had their heads covered by blankets, making them really hard to identify. Most people think that Sefton is joking when he asks if he can cook them, but I think there's a good chance he legitimately thought they were giant shellfish or something. No one warns him until the last second. And here's the big theory. When he mentions a pretty shell, I think he's not talking about the glowing shells, I think he just means the shell of the creature. He's just looking at the mermaid's tail, remember? And if he's thinking about eating a giant lobster, you'd examine the shell, right? It's touching the tail that causes the mermaid to thrash back. In the death scene, we can probably about see everything that Sefton could see, even more now that the tail has moved, and you can't see any glowing shells, nor can you see any in the next scene. I think the shells have already been taken to the captain's quarters, and that Sefton is ironically a red herring. But that's the weakest part of this theory. The rest of it works nicely, I swear. Let's go to a little while later, when the crab riders are attacking the boats. The captain, turning up late to the fight and discovering them on the orlop decks, shouts, "They make for the lazarette! Secure the hold!" Out of interest, by the way, the crew are already way ahead of him here. Nathan and Winston have already limped along the back of the ship, collected a gun and headed down into the cargo hold to set up an ambush, while Viator has opened the hatch down. So the captain shouting orders isn't extremely useful. But the point is, the captain learns here that the monsters are after the mermaids and not the shells, which is why he's only concerned about the lazarette. He doesn't think the shells are important, as the crab riders have ignored them. So, when the Kraken attacks later, what does the captain do? He ignores the shells and goes straight for the mermaids, because he figures that they're the ones that summoned the crab riders and now the Kraken. But wouldn't it make more sense for him to toss the shells first? Well, he could have done, but I think it's more likely he just ignored them. If he did toss the shells before killing the mermaids, then he probably would have started above deck. We need to somehow get to the cargo hold during the Kraken attack, but we don't see him in any memory. Plus, this grate remains closed, meaning he probably didn't go that way. And Abigail is asking for the captain as if she's not sure where he is, and Paul starts off in the kitchen, but he's the only one that seems to know that the captain throws the shells, so I don't think that the captain throws the shells overboard yet. I think that the shells remain in the captain's quarters for the Kraken attack. When the Kraken withdraws, the captain leaves the last mermaid alive. Maybe he notices the formation shell, but it doesn't matter if he does or not, because he isn't bothered by it. Why would he be? He's already scared of the Kraken. A pretty shell is the least of his worries. When he exits the cargo hold, his crew are waiting for him, surprised that the Kraken has just left. As John Davies tells us later, the captain announces that he has chased the Kraken off, and tells everyone to clear up and get back to work. But then the captain finds the body of his wife, and Martin tells him what happened privately in his quarters. The captain tells Martin about the mermaids in the lazarette, which explains why Martin isn't surprised that there's only one mermaid alive when he goes there later. But why did Abigail die? Here's the interesting part. Imagine you're Abigail and you're inside the captain's quarters, the Kraken's attacking outside, your husband's missing, when suddenly you notice that the shells that he displayed as a trophy are glowing brighter than before. Could these shells be the cause of the curse? You tell your theory to Paul, who doesn't know what to do, so you run outside to try and warn the captain, where of course you meet your demise. This is a bit of speculation of course, but placing the shells inside the captain's quarters means Abigail actually has a reason to try and find the captain, rather than just out of panic. Plus she doesn't sound that panicked in her death scene, she sounds reasonable, so I quite like this theory. Now the captain finds Abigail dead, and Paul, who is tasked with looking after the passengers, explains that Abigail thought the shells had something to do with the curse. The captain, aggrieved and distraught, throws the shells from the balcony. You probably only see them as excess treasure anyway. The main treasure is the live mermaid in the lazarette. After all, what's more impressive, a mythical beast or a shell? And besides, the shells will always remind him of his wife that he failed to save in time. Maybe they were even originally meant as a gift to her. At any rate, the captain doesn't tell the rest of his crew about the shells because what he does with his treasure is none of their business. And by this stage, he's presumably forgotten about the shell that Dahl was holding, or else he doesn't really care about it. He knows they weren't the real reason the Kraken was attacking anyway. Following this, Martin learns that the mermaids were responsible for the Kraken attack, and that there's still one left. He doesn't trust the captain's interrogation skills to keep the beasts at bay forever though. Or perhaps he just takes pity on the remaining mermaid. So he decides to collect the remaining 2 stewards and rescue the last mermaid himself. There are a number of reasons why I think they're going behind the captain's back. First, the captain has purposely left the last mermaid alive. He probably fears returning to England with nothing to show for his troubles, or wishes to keep the mermaid as a bargaining chip. Second, Martin gives specific instructions to the other 2 to throw the mermaid overboard, which he wouldn't have needed to do if the captain had instructed them to do the same thing. Third, at the start of chapter 9, Viator talks about selling the wretched fish, so is presumably unaware that the last mermaid has already been thrown overboard, indicating that Paul and Davy was secretive. And fourth, Martin tells the others to lock the door when they leave, perhaps so that it becomes harder for anyone else to discover that the mermaid is missing. Paul either discards the key or purposely hides it, but he tells Evans afterwards that the key is gone. Either way, there's definitely a suggestion that they're keeping things secret. The only other reason to lock the door would be the Formosan chest, but it's very unlikely that Martin knows anything about that. However, of course, Martin is fatally spiked. His dying wish is for the mermaids to see the Obra Dinn home. Perhaps he overestimates the power of the mermaids, as this task actually takes several years to accomplish. Finally, it's time to talk about the last chapter, the events of the mutiny. By this point, 2 mermaids are dead, 2 shells have been thrown overboard, and the last shell was given to the last mermaid and both were also tossed overboard. There is no longer any supernatural danger on this ship whatsoever. Furthermore, a mermaid has been tasked with guiding the ship home. If they can fix the sails and get a bit of speed up, they might just survive. However, it's important to understand that the mutiny squad don't know any of this. As far as they're aware, the captain took the dangerous shells at the beginning, then monsters started attacking the ship, then the captain went down to the lazarette, something weird happened, and now he's claiming that he's chased the monsters off. On top of this, both Martin and the captain's steward are dead in the lazarette. Think back to when you first played the game. What did you think happened in chapter 8? Probably that the captain did some sort of evil ritual, sacrificed a couple of people to ward off the Kraken, harnessing the power of the mystical shells. And now he's locked himself in his quarters, overcome by greed over the shells, not letting anyone else in. It's not a bad theory. And with rumours of a curse spreading on the ship, who could blame you for believing it? To top it all off, guess who was there when Philip Dahl warned that the mermaids carried a curse? Bill Hoskett. And after finding out that his sister died because she feared the shells, he's decided to take control himself and end the curse once and for all. Of course, we eventually learn that it's a curse that doesn't exist. The real tragedy of Chapter 8 isn't learning what the captain does, it's in the realisation that the attempted mutiny in Chapter 10 was all for nothing. So the mutiny squad turn up at the captain's door to demand the shells. The captain threw the shells away a long time ago. He knows he can't give them what they want, and he's angry that they dare to try and take his treasure. When Brennan asks where the shells are, the captain gloats as he tells Brennan the truth. They're at the bottom of the sea. Brennan is shocked, he doesn't believe it. They're in the middle of attempting mutiny over nothing? But the realisation comes too late. Soon everyone on board is dead. The captain, hopeless and already twice stabbed, shoots himself. Martin presumably wanted the ship guided home so his fellow crew members would survive, but they all died or left very quickly, and so the lone mermaid guides the ghost ship back home, a difficult endeavour that takes several years. She then watches from afar as the hand of bureaucracy gives it to once over, and then leaves. The mermaid, having fulfilled her end of the bargain and no longer wishing for her former prison to remain afloat, begins a storm as you have viewed the last memory. A short while after you leave, the Obra Dinn sinks, taking with it the Formosan chest, bodies of the crew members, and the bodies of the beasts. But that's just my theory. This game has been a bit of an obsession of mine over the past couple of months. Hopefully you've learned something new. I only ended up making this video because I couldn't really find this depth of information anywhere else on the internet. There is still one agonising question. Why did the ship take so long to reach Falmouth? The answer was staring us in the face since we first climbed on board. The mermaids took the goat on holiday to Barbados.